and Romans 1 loves to use that little phrase, created and creator. So in the story of Abraham and what his life is about. In fact, let me read to you what I've written just again to be really clear for you so that as we talk through Abraham's life, you have this on your slides if you want to review them. The primary covenant story of the Bible begins once territorial authority had been delegated by Yahweh. Genesis 1 through 11 has to take place before you get to 12. Okay? Then in 12, here's what happens. A wealthy landowner who is actively worshiping Babylon's patron deity, who is Marduk, we know that from history, converted then to the worship of Yahweh. We don't know how Yahweh contacted Abraham. It might have been through an Elohim or a messenger, or it might have been a prophet. Again, you just never know how God contacts Noah and all these people. But a covenant is formed. The deal offered by this Elohim, Yahweh, will be as unique as it will be unambiguous. Imagine the creator of the universe coming to you as you walk out your tent flap, and he says, worship me, and I'll bless you more than you can ever imagine. It reminds me, back when I was doing my dissertation, around the same time that Dr. Mike was doing his on the Divine Council, I was doing mine on the New Testament principalities and powers, and we had a lot of fun just talking through our material because they were connected, of course. And I was sitting at a Perkins, I'll never forget, 2 or 3 in the morning, and just mulling over stuff, typing. And I read this prayer, and let me tell you what happened. This is a prayer that's not in the Bible, okay? Every day worship your God. Sacrifice and benediction are the proper accompaniment of incense. Present your free will offering to your God, for this is proper toward the gods. Prayer, supplication, and prostration. Offer him daily, and you will get your reward. Then you will have full communion with your God. In your wisdom, study the tablet. Reverence begets favor. Sacrifice prolongs life. Prayer atones for guilt. I wish I knew that these things were pleasing to one's God. What is proper to oneself is an offense to one's God. Who knows the will of the gods in heaven? Who understands the plans of the underworld gods? Where have mortals learned the way of a God? This is a Sumerian prayer that we've unearthed around the time of Moses. And I remember reading this at Perkins, or our restaurant there by my house, early in the morning. And then I was in the Psalms reading about God's love of David and David's love for God. And I remember just crying, bawling. And my waitress came up to me asking if I was okay. And I said, oh, it's just the Bible, I said, But here's the point. Yahweh comes to Abraham and says, if you worship me, I'll bless you and make you great. Meanwhile, the world is asking this question: how do I know what the gods want? And now we have an answer to one man. And my assumption would be that Abraham had to make this deal. In other words, it wasn't just a unilateral, you're going to worship me. This was his choice. So here's what God said to him: get out of your country, from your father's house, to a land I'll show you. I'm not even going to tell you where it is yet. I'll make you a great nation. I'll bless you. You shall be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you. Watch this now. I will curse him who curses you. That cursing will be a part of the story that will come up later. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Now, what we often forget to do is keep the story going. Listen to what he does. And notice, if you can see, now that I'm showing you, how do you know that Abraham is worshiping the right Elohim? And there, 3 verses later, there Abraham built an altar to Yahweh, who had appeared to him. And he moved there to the mountain east of Bethel, so forth. And there he built, last 2 lines, there he built an altar to Yahweh and called on the name of Yahweh. Do you see that worship languages? That's a very Semitic way of talking. To call upon the name of a God and to build an altar to that God was the way that you showed in that culture obeisance to a deity. So these are phrases that you need to underline and catch as a movement of the story as to which God this man is worshiping. 13:4, again, same thing happens. He calls upon the name of Yahweh. He's traveling as this is happening. Remember the story in Genesis 14, Melchizedek, a king of Jerusalem, before it's Jerusalem, comes out and they meet and they realize they worship the same deity. Now, again, how did God contact Melchizedek? We have no idea. But Melchizedek said, blessed be Abram of the high God. Doesn't have a name for him yet. Possessor of heaven and earth, and blessed be this high God, El the High One, Elohim, the High One, who has delivered your enemies into your hands. So again, two people meeting, a pagan, by the way, Melchizedek is obviously a non-Jew, because Abraham is the first one. So you get a pagan and a Jew or a Hebrew meeting, and they worship the same deity. Now you're supposed to say, what in the world is going on here? The text doesn't tell you, and it's not until you get to Psalms and then eventually to Hebrews that the story of Melchizedek becomes a part of the luster of the Jewish story, but we'll leave that. Again, just following Abraham. We're just going to get up to his death in 26 or so. 21, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree. There he called on the name of Yahweh, El Olam, the God of eternity, or the God of the age. And he sojourned, and I throw that in there because if you have never owned a home and never do and die a renter, welcome to Abraham's life. He never got what God promised him in the sense of himself. He died a renter, and yet he, from the other side of death, can look back upon a story that God has made for him and his family because of his faithfulness, his loyalty to the right God. The whole story works on that level. Do you see how sin and forgiveness and ritual and sacrifice, in the sense of forgiveness and all that, it's just not there? And if you want to go looking for something, you could, but you don't need to. It's right in front of us that the story is about worship. Proposition number 2. Now let's go from 12 through 50. Genesis 12 through 50. The long story of Genesis presents individuals within Abraham's family choosing one Elohim over another. By the way, this is fun to me. I could let you go on this one, and you could just page through your Bible and find this. But my picture there is just trying to say Abraham worshiped the right God. Isaac worships the right Elohim. Ishmael worships other gods. And you can tell by the story, Jacob worships the right one and Esau the wrong one. And you can work your way through the story easily, I'd say, if you know what to look for. We only have time for 2 examples. I'm going to grab Ishmael and Esau. Again, in my story, I just recommended that Ishmael worshipped another deity, and so did Esau. Well, what's the evidence for that? I have a list in my Bible, but for time, let me give you one. Sarah, your wife, God says, shall bear you a son, Isaac. I, God talking, will establish my covenant with him. Again, it's a two-way thing. Isaac has a choice, but he's telling the end of the story from the beginning. I will have a covenant with Isaac. And as for Ishmael, you're waiting for that word covenant. He's going to be my guy too. Here's what you get. I have blessed him. Oh, he's going to be rich. He'll have 12 princes. I'll make him a great nation. But my covenant, that's with his brother. So his half-brother. So you get the sense, and again, I'd recommend you read the story of Ishmael, watching how it lays out, and it's clear. He is never a worshiper of Yahweh. The other one is even more fun because it just shows, by the way, the authority of Scripture, the carefulness with which Scripture is written and recorded. You have this story in Genesis 27. Jacob and Esau. Well, Jacob is trying to trick his father Isaac into thinking he's Esau because he wants the family blessing. Another one of those cultural things that we don't have today. And here's what happens. Jacob says to his father, I am Esau, your firstborn. I have done just as you told me. Please arise, sit and eat of my game. Remember, he goes out and gets food and brings it back, that your soul may bless me. But Isaac said to his son Esau, right? He's talking to Esau. How is it that you have found it so quickly, my son? And he, Jacob, says, pretending to be Esau, Yahweh, and never forget to read those pronouns, your Elohim. Jacob knew he had to sound like Esau theologically. He had to feel like him, smell like him, sound like him, and theologize like him. Esau never claims in the story, and there's a lot of information on this, Esau never claims Yahweh as his own. So in trying to sound like Esau, Jacob, if he had been speaking for himself, would have said Yahweh my or Yahweh our, but because it's Esau, Dad, he's your God, not mine. All right, so again, I'd recommend just watch through the story. Joseph and the 12 brothers or 11 brothers. What evidence are is there that the 11 brothers are Yahwists? I'd say it's very scanty. If you look at it carefully, it's a good chance that Joseph is the only Yahwist among his brothers, and that's why going down to Egypt is so important, and so forth and so on. But I'm going to let that go for time. Let's keep moving the story forward. Think of now Exodus and on. A period of national law followed Israel's redemption or escape from Egypt. This is a 900-year, 1440 to 586 kind of thing. So it's a 900-year sub-story, I would call it. And here's the question that we often deal with. Oh, I thought that law or the period of law helps people become righteous. Well, no. I would recommend it never changes the story of how to become righteous. It's a sub-story meant to be understood within its own interpretations. Could I again read to you what I would say in a classroom if we could take our time? How does it work? Mosaic law is often misunderstood again, so let me give you my impression of as how this works. At Sinai, Israel was given her own set of laws for governance as a nation. Our Western view of law is very British. It starts with the Romans and it goes to Britain, and now it's very American, where if it says 55, you drive 55, right? Our Western view of law is rather recent, however, in understanding the story of Sinai. In Eastern tradition, a law basically served as an encouragement toward proper living, kind of a hope so. It would be good if you did this. I'm not saying it's trite. I'm saying that they didn't interpret it as if you do it, you're going to get punished. They took it as, a lot of guys would, kind of like a platform. I'll mention that coming up. The laws of Moses were not meant to be used, in other words, as literal laws to be obeyed. That's because they didn't think of it that way in that culture. They simply didn't think of law that way. Laws worked as what a political platform, like a candidate. When I'm president, I will. Well, no. Saying, here is what we know we should do, even want to do on a consistent basis. Thus, many Mosaic laws, think of this, were never enforced, even by Moses. For example, Moses did not enforce circumcision. We find out later during the 40-year wilderness wandering, Joshua 5. And there is no evidence that specific laws, such as rebellious sons or idol worshippers being put to death, was ever carried out. In short, Mosaic law worked, think of this, after Israel's covenant. The whole Mosaic law story is a sub-story under a covenant that God had already made with Abraham's family. So it's not replacing it at all. It's just how this nation would work. All right, ready for proposition number 4. Again, moving into the story of the New Testament even further. The most famous convert during Joshua's Canaanite conquest, and let's use that word convert carefully now, because if you already worshiped Yahweh as a child, let's say Deuteronomy, is it 6, 4 through 6? Love the Lord your God and talk about him when you rise up and sit down and so forth. And when your kids ask, here's what you say. It's possible to be a Yahwist from childhood, and you don't have to ever convert. But the most famous convert during the Joshua's Canaanite conquest was Rahab. Do you remember her from Jericho? A Canaanite who committed her loyalty to Yahweh and requested that Yahweh be loyal to her in return. Beautiful verses there in Joshua 2. Again, if you're looking for it, it's easy to see it. If you're looking for sin, you see her prostitution. But if you see her loyalty, it's a beautiful story. So very easy, simplistic way of describing it. She's a Jerichoite worshiping a Canaanite god. And she says this in Joshua 2, as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted, neither did there remain in us any more courage. For Yahweh, your Elohim, he is Elohim in heaven above and earth beneath. He's the top dog. I mean, if you want to get that, he is the one. Now that's a lot for a woman to say within her own home about her own past and her own people, the ones that would protect her in time of war. She's admitting there's a better God than the one she has. And by the way, she says, make a deal with, remember the guys are going to put out, or she's going to put out a purple cord and have her life saved. She puts Yahweh under a, like, he'll owe me life if. Read Joshua 2, like 13 and on, because what's fascinating about that, that's all about a covenant. When you make a covenant with the deity, you expect something back from that deity, and that deity expects you to think that way. And she does that. She actually puts Yahweh under a covenant that her life will be saved and the life of her family if she converts and shows the cord. So it's a beautiful picture of exactly what we're talking about, and that is covenanting with the right deity. Proposition number 5, moving through the Old Testament, keep moving from left to right. The most famous convert of the Judges period, at the end of Judges, is Ruth, which is kind of during the Judges period. A Moabitess, remember her, who authored the now famous "Your people, my Elohim," or "Your Elohim, my Elohim." Beautiful phrase. And again, what you have here is a story of two. We have a Jewish woman who has a Jewish husband, Naomi and her husband. Her 2 boys are Jewish men who marry Moabitess women. All the men die, and you have 3 women left, the mother-in-law to the 2 Moabite women. One of them leaves, the other one is Ruth, and she says that famous line, "Entreat me not to leave you, Naomi, or to turn back," and there it is, "be your people, my people." She proselytizes to the Jewish traditions as well. "And my Elohim," or "your Elohim, my Elohim." So it's again, if we were to see that day, she would have gone back. Ruth would have to her home. Well, if she had one, I'm trying to think how's this going to work. She's married. He dies. I don't know, but she stops worshiping the Moabite goddess Chemosh, or god Chemosh, somewhere along the way. So this is a story again of changing Elohim, as I've shown there. So we have Ruth. Well, we have Rahab and Ruth. By the way, they're both related to David. So let's keep going forward. And David is a tough one because there's so much material. My goodness. Here I'm just going to say, come on, I think we all know this one. David is a good Yahweh loyalist, and it's not hard to find that. But let me recommend something to you about his predecessor, King Saul. No Old Testament character confirmed how to attain and retain personal righteousness better than King David. I think the whole story of the King David, or King Saul to King David movement, is Saul was not a Yahwist. And if you look for the right verses, if you look for the story, you'll see. I'd recommend 5 or 6 points here. I did the Naked Bible podcast with Trey on 1 Samuel 21, 23, and 26, and 28. 21, 23, 26, 28. So if you ever have a chance to listen to the Naked Bible podcast and get into the Samuel stuff, those 4, I deal with Saul being a non-Yahwist, and I give all the information that I can't hear. Chat GPT, the AI artificial intelligent thing that you can talk to on your computer, I asked it, or him, or was it a her? I don't know, sure what it is. Was King Saul a Yahwist? I just thought, I wonder if you're as good as people say you are. Can you think in divine counsel worldview ways and tell me if King Saul was a Yahwist? Here's the answer Chat GPT gave me. King Saul was a follower of Yahweh, the God of Israel, and he's generally considered to be a Yahwist. He was anointed as the first king of Israel by Samuel. Saul himself was also known to consult with Yahweh through the prophet Samuel. However, it is worth noting that Saul's devotion to Yahweh was not always consistent, and I won't read the whole thing, but he basically says, yeah, he wasn't a very good guy, though, and he could have done better. Well, you know how in ChatGPT you can talk back to it. And so I said, I don't like your answer because you didn't deal with the Bible. You gave me standard commentary stuff. I want you to think AI here and give me intelligence that goes beyond standard commentaries. What biblical evidence do you have for these assertions? I would like to know what texts defended your points. He shot right back. Amazing how fast this thing is. The Bible provides several pieces of evidence that suggest King Saul was a Yahwist. Again, take your time with the slides and read them on your own. I'd recommend that not one of these proves his point. He used the Urim and Thummim, so what? Again, that doesn't prove anything. God didn't talk to him. God won't talk to Saul during his Urim and Thummim, so that proves to me, number 2, that God didn't consider him Yahwist. 3 makes no sense. 4, Saul's pursuit of David. Absolute no sense, Mr. ChatGPT. Why would Saul chasing David prove he's a Yahwist? I think you're really searching here, stretching. 5. Yahweh's initial approval of Saul. Well, I know, but God chose Eglon, king of Moab, to do something in the book of Judges. God can choose anyone to do anything. So the fact that God chose Saul to be the first king. Again, I'm recommending that Mr. Chat GPT went to the commentaries and he said, well, that's a good question. Is Saul a Yahwist? Here's what humanity has said. I'd recommend that we haven't thought through it, though, if that's the best that he can do. And that there's much better evidence that Saul never, 1 Samuel 14:35, he puts a sacrifice together after having sacrificed a couple of times. And it says that was the first sacrifice he made to Yahweh. So it tells you a political moment in Saul's life, he makes a sacrifice to Yahweh. Well, then why, if this is the first to Yahweh, what about the other ones before it? That kind of thing. Got to move on. Proposition number 7, pushing our way through the Old Testament story. The divided monarchies of Israel and Judah, remember these two nations split apart, and between them, they both have 19 kings. A majority of these leaders gave their allegiance to the gods of Canaan. It's an amazing, if you look at it this way, it's an amazing story of not sinfulness and not the nation having problem with outside, military problems. It's a story of how kings who come from the line of David and other families can't figure out which Elohim to worship. This will lead both nations eventually into exile. Listen again just to the tone of these kinds of verses. God tore the kingdom away from the house of David and gave it to you. And yet you, forget the king here, you have not been as my servant David. He's long gone. David's long dead. Who kept my commandments and followed me with all his heart to only do what was right in my eyes. Now we know David sinned. Why would the writer of Kings say this kind of language? Because he's looking not for perfection. Remember how marriage works? You look for faithfulness. You come home to the right house at night. This is David's life. David never looked into the heavens and said, I think Chemosh is my guy. He simply, no matter thick or thin, he said, Yahweh, you are my shepherd. Another one, again, it's across the page in my Bible. Abijam walked in all the sins of his father, which he had done before him. His heart was not loyal to Yahweh, his Elohim. Now, Abijam claimed Yahweh, but watch what happens. As was the heart of his father David. Again, David's gone. Nevertheless, for David's sake, Yahweh, his Elohim, gave him a lamp in Jerusalem by setting up his son after him and by establishing Jerusalem, because David, not Abijam, did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, it should be Yahweh, and had not turned aside from anything that he had commanded him all the days of his life. Oh, by the way, except for Uriah. I think the writer is saying, okay, I could talk about David in glowing terms, but everyone's going to remember Uriah, so I better mention that. So yes, sin is a problem. In God's eyes, God doesn't want us to sin, but that's not the issue when it comes to loyalty and Yahweh. Proposition number 8, again, moving beyond now the kings. Remember Naaman of 2 Kings 5? He's a Syrian general who becomes clean through washing in the Jordan, and he loads his mule with some dirt from Israel because he wants to go home and worship Yahweh, but he knows he can't go to the temple of Rimmon where his king is and worship in the temple because that's Rimmon's temple. He takes loads of dirt from Israel to put on the ground so he can stand on Yahweh's turf. It's a fantastic story. It's a good story of a conversion. And Jonah's Ninevites. Remember, Jonah goes to, he's the first missionary, shall we call it, of the Old Testament. These are late Old Testament examples of pagans who became righteous through their allegiance to Yahweh, and they didn't have pocket-sized, Torahs in their bags. They weren't following Mosaic prescriptions at all. At all. They weren't following Sabbath. They weren't following kosher. They weren't sacrificing and atoning and all that. They didn't need to. That's the point. And so we're supposed to take this kind of information and see what God is doing when it comes to the salvation of people in the Old Testament. In fact, Jonah, it's almost a comic relief moment in a sad way. Ah, Yahweh, was not this what I said when I was still in my country? Therefore I fled previously to Tarshish, for I know, remember what happens is the people believe in Yahweh, and God doesn't smite them. Now I know that you're a gracious and merciful Elohim, slow to anger. I mean, it's a beautiful phrase, but it's said in absolute frustration that he wanted these. Remember how Genesis 12, 1-3 said, I will bless you, but I will curse those who curse you. Jews will hang on to that cursing as a way to be an us versus them issue. We'll talk about that coming up in our doctrine of salvation, because it makes a big deal to the story to come. And here's part of that, where a Jew is frustrated that God is nice to the non-Jew. Proposition number 9. Now, I've said this before, but let's make it an actual clear proposition. Notions of sacrifice, atonement, and strict obedience to Mosaic law have traditionally been included in evangelical discussions. When you read Bible commentators and theologians, and how, just ask your pastor or ask the commentators, how do people get saved in the Old Testament? They'll usually dive into Mosaic law somewhere, and then even bring in sacrifice was part of that, and forgiveness of sins through ritual. I'd recommend, that last line, give me the facts. Show me anywhere where a person did a sacrifice and became righteous. And this is a terrible picture, but you can kind of make it out. This is my Leviticus, first page in Leviticus. And I wrote this to myself after I was done reading it once. Not found in the book. The word faith is not in Leviticus. Save, salvation, repent, mercy, anger, wrath, righteous, justify, or just, the derivative of righteous. The word love does not occur in Leviticus. What's the point? This book is not about salvation. This book is not about how to be right with God. It's, Leviticus. It's a book about what to do if you touch a corpse and you're a farmer, a carcass. What do you do? Well, you go down to the tabernacle. If you want to go to the tabernacle, you're going to have to clean up. And the way to do that is this, that, and the other. It's all sorts of rules. It has nothing to do with salvation. So don't ever, again, mix these words, salvation and justification and righteousness, thinking they're all over the Bible. Look where they're found. And you can, again, do this by just searching on your computer program for this kind of thing. Well, Mr. ChatGPT, I asked you the same question. How is a person made righteous in the Old Testament? I'm just curious. Again, take your time with this if you'd like to pause the screens. But he basically says, you follow the laws of Moses. And here's what they're like. It's good to have faith. I don't know what it is, but it's good to have it. I mean, here, and we're going to talk about this next time. What does that word even mean? I'd recommend that ChatGPT just throws words at you, because it doesn't, he's copying what humans have done and just throws words around thinking, makes good sense. I'd recommend this is not, again, that's a good verse. And these are good verses, but he doesn't use the words in the way we're going to recommend. Additionally, and this is at the end, the Old Testament contains many examples of individuals who are considered righteous due to their actions and attitudes. For example, Job, King David. I just think, again, it shows that we're not talking theology when you get into AI. It's going to spit back to you what commentators have said, and I think they're looking for the wrong thing. I'm ready for our last proposition for this module, preparing us next time for explaining idolatry, belief, righteousness, kind of a textual module to make sure we know what these words mean. Leaving the Old Testament story. Israel's prophets, by the way, there's a backstory here. I remember giving a paper in my doctoral seminar once, and I came up with this conclusion in my doctoral paper. About a dozen students and a professor who worldwide known. If I said his name, a lot of you know it for his books. And I'll never forget finishing my paper, and my professor was incensed. He was so mad. I could, he did it theologically, but he basically just tore me apart in front of the students. And he called me, very kind of him, that week and said, how are you doing? He didn't apologize as much as just say he apologized, but he was very nice. My point is this: what I'm about to read is surprising to me, defended by evangelicals in the other way. They're going to have trouble with this because they know where this is going if you let this stand. Leaving the Old Testament story, Israel's prophets made a united call for their people to return to worship Elohim. Sacrifice and ritual were not included. Usually, and again, here's where my prof went, well, clean it up. Clean up your sacrifice. And my point of the paper was, get rid of it. Get rid of it, and God will be relieved. Come and let us return to Yahweh. He has torn, he will heal us. He will come to us like the rain. And even the quote from God, it seems, for I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I mean, how do you deny textually how the Old Testament is ending compared to how it started, where Abraham sacrifices to show loyalty? That's just what you did. You weren't substituting lambs for sin and all that stuff. We'll talk about that later. You were simply showing loyalty, and here's how it ends. Just forget the whole thing. If you don't want to sacrifice, don't sacrifice. I don't need more blood. I really don't. I want you, right? And so that prepares us again for next time. That will be section 4 to come, which is the background of idolatry, belief, righteousness, and faith.
So yeah, I was having a little bit of trouble paying attention, not because the lecture or anything like that, because I'm really sleepy. But I'm hoping one of y'all could like share some notes so I can learn what he was talking about, kind of,
Well, I'll try my best because I was right there with you. I'm kind of tired too today, but I appreciated the fact that he started off in Genesis. Can y'all hear me? Okay, for some reason I couldn't hear you guys for a second. Like there was some background noise and I couldn't hear anymore. But anyways, so I appreciate